So let's see. I wanted to try and explore some ideas about games and playing, actually, that have been running around my head. Um, and one of them involves basically the idea of what you would call them playgrounds, indoor playgrounds, or something like that. It's this thing that, as far as I can tell, was mainly popular in the 90s, I feel. And I guess um, it's sort of like an indoor space that is organized like a playground, but because it's indoors, it can allow itself to be made of cushiony sort of materials and safer sort of materials for children to fall on. And what this sort of causes is that the structures, the playground-like structures that are created in these sort of places, are more dangerous in an adventure-like way. There are big drops and higher kind of peaks to climb and places you can swing on, and there's not so much danger because if you fall, it's all cushiony and safe. And I'm really fascinated by these structures because they're so dangerous in their design. Again, it's a sort of danger that evokes adventure. But again, it's sort of this thing that it wakes up in me. And I think I'm thinking about these places because they are in some way the sort of epitome of a game for me. It's what I think of. I think when I think of games, is a structure that you move through, and it's somehow dangerous to move through. There are sort of obstacles to cross and things like that. But it's ultimately safe. The danger is in the role playing almost. It's theatrically dangerous. It evokes danger. It evokes steep pits you could fall into. It evokes spikes even and big obstacles that could squash you, but everything is safe. Because it's safe, it can allow itself to have this sort of almost torture chamber kind of aesthetic. And also it's very flat sort of thing. It tends to not be very intricately decorated, which is, I think, part of why it's safe, because it doesn't have many sort of little spiky things and Baroque style decorations on it. It's very flat surfaces made of stable sort of soft materials. Yeah, I was sort of fascinated by this. I was trying to read up on the whole school of thought that even came up with the idea of playgrounds before indoor playgrounds were a thing, like the old school sort of idea of playgrounds. And I can't remember who it was, but there is this whole idea of playgrounds as something constructed, sort of virtualizing the idea of play. That's what I find really fascinating, right? Because you can play on trees and in the river, and I imagine that we always have animals of different kinds play, right, in their environment. And playgrounds are like this condensed version of play, where you grab the abstract concepts of swinging on a tree, but you apply it to pure geometric shapes. It's no longer a tree. It's maybe just a metal pole with a swinging thing on it. You apply the concept of just anything that you could do in nature, but you kind of virtualize it. And that's fascinating to me somehow. I have this sort of weird theory that I'd like to sort of develop that somehow video games are related to this trend of creating virtual spaces aimed at children to experience play in a sort of simulated environment, but it's an environment that simulates the world, the world. You know, everything that surrounds the playground and that the playground is contained within. It's sort of it's I don't know. It's complicated. It's hard to know why exactly these things emerge. I read this book recently, The Dialectic of Sex, which was very interesting and had a whole sort of chapter on childhood and the idea that childhood is something that has a sort of a constructed character to it, in the sense that the strict division between childhood and adulthood, the author argued, was something that has emerged historically and culturally, that we have kind of created children's literature, children's fashion, children's sort of things. We've created things for children, and sort of created a category of human called children, but that it's not so clear really where the boundary is, or what the difference is, and what kind of effects, I guess, being treated as a child would have on a human. And yeah, so this is slightly unrelated, but it just sort of goes back to the idea of playgrounds. I'm sort of interested in exploring why playgrounds exist, what the philosophy behind them was, in what context they emerged, and so forth. But I guess, returning to indoor playgrounds, it's funny to me, I mentioned this is something that I think, from what I can tell, was a very sort of 80s and 90s thing. And I'm kind of guessing that maybe it was earlier, but it seems like the materials used for these sorts of playgrounds were the kinds of materials that were popularized in those eras, sort of different forms of rubber and plastic that, obviously would have existed maybe, I don't know when plastic was introduced. I imagine sometime in the, well, who knows, the 50s? I don't know. But it's as if there is, see, the way I see it is almost as if what indoor playgrounds were trying to achieve was what video games then achieved in the 80s and 90s. That is to say, to create an inner space that is made of platforms to jump on. It's this very abstract human world. There are no trees, no rocks. It's just basic geometric shapes, rectangles, triangles, spheres, and children running around this sort of platform world. And that's what, popular video games of that time were beginning to do, right? Mario and Sonic and all these games were introducing, I guess. I mean, not introducing, but popularizing, I guess, at a world scale. And we'd have to look at the history of this, but popularizing the whole idea of platforming as a style of game. The idea that running on platforms and cursing through obstacles was a form of play, which is what those playgrounds were in a sense. And I can imagine that the reason those kinds of playgrounds stopped being so popular then onwards, one of the reasons I imagine must have been because of the rise of video games and home consoles, right? Because it's the same idea. That's what I find uncanny. It's almost as if inner playgrounds were trying to were really trying to recreate a virtual world, but they were using plastic and rubber and these materials that were just, I guess, more cumbersome and costly to work with. And video game comes along and starts doing the same thing, but with with pixels. It's a weird sort of technological shift almost. The the idea of platforming kind of forces the game, the playground, to be, as I said, very minimalistic, because you're working with very basic structures. You're not walking on rugged, rocky terrain. You're walking on flat surfaces. You know, it it's like a view of the world emerges at that point in time, maybe, where the world is like a box of very simple shapes, and there is a subject, the subject that is coursing through that space. The space is so minimalistic, it's so sort of mathematical in its aesthetic, that it evokes immateriality. There is very little subjectivity in that world. There is you, the subject, and then there is the terrain, the environment. The environment is not seen in those kinds of spaces as a collection of beings, as an ecosystem, in the way that, again, that we would see, that we would tend to see the natural world if we were to study it from an ecosystem's perspective. That is to say that the environment is made of worms in the soil, microbes in the soil, plants, microbes in the water, fish in the water, trees. It's almost, it's sort of almost entirely made of living things, as we would describe them, right? Yeah, there is soil, there are rocks, but it's teeming with life at many levels. So in a sense, if we consider ourselves to be one more of those living organisms, then to be placed within an environment is to be placed amongst living beings. And you are just one more of them. You're sort of in a community of living beings. But games sort of abstract that idea into the idea of, I guess, the sort of, I don't know if it emerges with Descartes, but maybe it is the Cartesian idea of there is a subject, there is a mind, and then everything else is robot. Everything else is non-living, in the sense of non-sentient, non-relatable. We can't relate to it. Just a sandbox space, And then we are here alone in this sort of sandbox space. And I just, something about that I find fascinating, how games evoke this kind of stark contrast between how we see ourselves and how we see the environment. The environment as a series of geometric shapes that you're walking through. And I'm not sure what else to say in this video, but that's definitely something I want to explore more, because as I explore in my video game sort of channel, I'm very interested in how video games and the fun of video games, the very fact that you're playing a game, the fun involved in it, awakes a certain love of those geometric shapes. You really enjoy those square platforms and kind of inanimate blocks in a way that, in a strange way, you uh, you're encouraged not to in culture. Almost, it's almost as if video games reach this state where the subject is enjoying being in that environment so much that it almost, I think, begins to relate to it. The environment begins to be a relatable place, a place where you can identify or feel in communion with the blocks and squares and triangles and objects in that space. I feel the concept of fun does that, and the simplification of the natural world, the drastic sort of abstraction of the natural world flips on its side. It becomes so abstract that it becomes relatable. I guess because these shapes become so basic that they become very easily archetypal, or they easily map onto symbolic content from the unconscious, and therefore acquire a certain sentience almost. So yeah, that and the relationship that it has to childhood, to the very idea of childhood as the past, because you see, if childhood is something constructed, I mean, you know, if there is a dimension to what we call childhood that is constructed, and if it is constructed partly by adults, then when adults create games for children, literature for children, specific places like schools, and you know, when adults create a world for children, which is a small little world that children will live in, and then they will exit that world and enter the world of adulthood. When that idea is created, adults are working with a symbol space that relates to themselves. In a sense, they are creating something that they were once in. You know, they once were children. So when they create a world for children, they're creating a world of their past, a world that for them is the past. So in a strange way, when adults are creating things for children, I think they're working with the archetype of the past. Children become people of the past for adults in a weird way, even though they're like also new. They're the new generation. They, for an adult, I think they represent the symbol of childhood, the symbol of the past, which from the adult's perspective is the past. So there is something very weird, I think, with how adults create this world for children, which includes playgrounds and games and so forth, that is in some way like a recreation of the adult's own past, of the adult's own idea of what the past is, which then the children are kind of reliving. I mean, in a sense, we're also sort of focused on the past, in the sense that the past seems to remain an area where things get locked up in emotional terms, right? Things that we go back to and unlock in some way. For example, in psychoanalysis, there is obviously the idea of going back to the past to recall forgotten content, forgotten experience, which upon being remembered or reaccessed unlocks a whole series of emotional knots or locks, which let us experience the world more fully, because we were sort of locked. We were locked in a way where it was harder and harder for us to feel the world and therefore interact with it, respond to it, because of this sort of lock in the emotions. Sort of how if one is still processing food, it becomes harder to eat new food, or for that new food to even be A, pleasurable, and B, healthy, right? Like, there is a way in which if a bunch of old food is left unprocessed in the past, any new food you're eating in the present is not going to be fully sort of experienced. To leave this metaphor for a second, if we go back to the issue of psychoanalysis, it's almost as if you respond to the present in a way that maps out the issues of the past that are not fully resolved. And so everything that you sort of engage with in the present becomes somehow archetypal of things in the past. There is some way in which the present then is almost sort of clamoring for your attention to bring into consciousness these contents. This is the kind of thing I imagine that in psychoanalysis would be attributed to dreams, for instance, right? That in dreams, these sorts of things come up into consciousness because the egoic censorship sort of barriers are weaker. Basically, the ego as a structure sort of weakens, and this allows things that are going on in the mind, things that are being processed, to actually be visibly processed, right? All the stuff that the ego wouldn't sort of allow itself to process. So I say this because it's this weakening of the ego, I think, during sleep that allows for this to happen, that basically the entire sort of field of sensory awareness in the present moment during sleep becomes a sort of an enormous area of confrontation with the past in some way. And I feel that, therefore, in some sense, if the ego were to be weakened during waking life in a similar way to how it's weakened in sleep, then the entire phenomenal world in waking life would become sort of a playground for these archetypes as well. That suddenly, within a weakened state, egoically, in waking life, the present moment becomes sort of a grounds for confronting the past. So basically, the present becomes the past in some way. The present becomes a projection space for the past. And I think that somehow playgrounds, games, childhood, things like this are also part of that, because they are the mapped out space from the adult perspective, which is the perspective that generally forms the material structures of the world, right? Sort of the material structures of the world we live in are built and generally created by adults. So childhood becomes sort of I think in some way it has something to do with this quest to the past, to find and unlock things that are wanting to be unlocked. Yeah.